General Hospital spoilers reveal that Brennan had always been a man who thrived in the shadows, orchestrating his moves so far ahead of anyone else that by the time his opponents realized they were even in a game, they had already lost. 4 months now. He had been playing a dangerous and deliberate double game within WSB, carefully balancing official missions with his own covert agenda. Behind the polite smile and calculated charm, Brennan was holding a secret so explosive it had the potential to shatter lives, careers, and even the fragile alliances that kept Port Charles from descending into chaos. That secret had a name, Morgan, and his continued existence was something Brennan guarded as both a weapon and a shield. Morgan had been taken off the grid years earlier, presumed dead by everyone who loved him, most painfully by Carly. Brennan had ensured that not a single scrap of information escaped to hint at the truth. Because Morgan's survival was leverage of the most potent kind. Keeping Morgan alive was not an act of mercy, it was an insurance policy. Brennan knew Carly's loyalty, when pushed to its limit, was a force that could be weaponized. With Morgan's life hanging in the balance, she could be manipulated into looking the other way, covering for him, or even participating in operations she would otherwise condemn. But Brennan's ambition did not stop with controlling Carly. He had also set his sights on the next generation, recruiting Jocelyn into the WSB under the guise of giving her purpose and agency. The young woman's energy, determination, and sharp instincts made her a perfect candidate. He played to her idealism, weaving stories about global threats, missions of justice, and the need for people willing to sacrifice for the greater good. Jocelyn, eager to make her own mark and step out of her mother's shadow, had agreed, unaware that she was being maneuvered into a web so dangerous that every day she remained inside it, the more impossible it would be to escape. What Brennan did not reveal was that Jocelyn's recruitment was not simply about adding another agent to WSB ranks. It was about control over Carly through her daughter, and control over Jocelyn herself, molding her into someone who could one day be used against her own family. He understood the psychological warfare at play. With both Morgan and Jocelyn under his influence, Brennan could effectively dictate Carly's actions without ever having to openly threaten her. She would know, even without words. That defiance would come at the cost of one of her children's lives. The adjustments Brennan had recently made to his plans were subtle on the surface, but their implications were vast. He began positioning Jocelyn in increasingly high-risk missions, partnering her with operatives like Vaughn, whose loyalty to Brennan outweighed any moral compass. Vaughn's presence ensured that if Jocelyn ever suspected the truth or tried to pull away, she would be swiftly and efficiently neutralized. Meanwhile, Morgan's captivity remained a ghostly absence, an unspoken reminder to Brennan himself that his ultimate card was still in his hand, ready to be played when the moment came to secure absolute compliance from Carly. Carly, for her part, was sensing that something was wrong, though she could not yet pinpoint the shape of the threat. The WSB had always been a source of distrust for her, a labyrinth of secrets where morality bent to the convenience of politics. But this felt personal. There was an undercurrent in Brennan's behavior, an intensity in the way he guarded certain information, that sent warning bells clanging in her mind. She had lost Morgan once, and the pain of that loss was something she carried like an open wound. To suspect, even in the smallest whisper of thought, that he might be alive somewhere, and that Brennan might have something to do with it, was almost too much to contemplate. And yet, she could not shake the feeling. As Brennan's machinations unfolded, Carly's days became a quiet, simmering storm. Every message from Jocelyn, every delayed call, every mission update filtered through Brennan's opaque channels gnawed at her nerves. She began piecing together patterns. The missions Jocelyn was assigned to seemed oddly tangential to WSB's main operations, often pulling her into locations or scenarios where Brennan himself had private interests. Carly's instinct told her that Jocelyn was being used for something far beyond what she had signed up for. And layered beneath that concern was an unspoken terror. What if Jocelyn stumbled onto the truth about Morgan before Carly did? What if her daughter, in her eagerness to prove herself, became entangled in the same chain that kept her brother hidden? Brennan's control was near total, but he underestimated one thing. Carly's capacity for calculated rage. She was not a woman who lashed out blindly. When provoked deeply enough, she planned, she adapted, and she struck with precision. The revelation of Brennan's true reach within WSB, combined with her growing conviction that he was holding Morgan, was transforming her from a wary observer into a quiet predator. She began gathering her own intelligence, using old contacts and discreet favors to probe into WSB's hidden corners. Each scrap of information she uncovered seemed to confirm her worst fears. Brennan's chain of influence ran deeper than anyone suspected, with operatives loyal to him scattered through the organization like embedded traps. Meanwhile, Jason was moving on his own trajectory, tracking Brennan for reasons of his own. His hunt had begun as a straightforward investigation into WSB corruption, but the trail had led him into increasingly dangerous territory, converging with Brennan's operations in ways that made it impossible for him to ignore Carly's connection. When whispers reached him about Jocelyn's recruitment and a ghost operative, whose existence was kept even from senior WSB staff, the pieces began to click. Jason didn't need proof to know Brennan was a threat. He could see it in the precision of his moves, the way his presence warped the choices of everyone around him. And if Morgan was truly alive and in Brennan's custody, Jason knew that every second wasted brought them closer to an unthinkable line that Brennan might one day decide to cross. For Carly, the storm was no longer something she could hold at bay. The adjustments Brennan made in his plans, moving Jocelyn closer to operational danger, tightening the invisible leash around Morgan, were pushing her toward a breaking point. The obsession that had taken root in her mind was no longer just about protecting her daughter. It was about tearing down the system that allowed Brennan to thrive. Every moment she spent near him was a test of her self-control, because beneath the forced civility, she was imagining all the ways this could end, some of them clean, but most of them bloody. And as the walls closed in, the reality became stark. Brennan's secret was a fuse, lit and burning toward an inevitable explosion. When it blew, it would not just destroy his carefully maintained network, it would detonate the fragile trust between Carly and Jocelyn. It would drag Jason into a war with WSB, and it would force Morgan out of the shadows in the most dangerous way possible. The only question was whether Carly would still be standing when the truth finally tore through the lies, or if Brennan's adjustments had already positioned her exactly where he wanted her. A step too late and a breath too short to save the people she loved. Carly's hatred for Brennan was no longer a passing fury. It had matured into something far darker, sharper, and more dangerous. It was the kind of hate that didn't burn hot and vanish in a rush of temper, but rather smoldered in the cold recesses of her mind, shaping itself into careful plans. Brennan had miscalculated from the start. He believed that by manipulating her loved ones, by reaching into the most vulnerable parts of her life and making them pieces in his games, he could bend her to his will. But Brennan had underestimated her in the most fatal way possible. He saw her as emotional, impulsive, perhaps even reckless, but he had never accounted for the precision she could summon when pushed far enough. And now, she had been pushed far enough. The latest adjustments to Brennan's strategies were impossible to ignore. They weren't just small tweaks to WSB operations, they were deliberate provocations. He had pulled Jocelyn into the core of his work, tightening the leash around her assignments, pairing her with Vaughn not just as a field partner but as a quiet handler whose first loyalty would always be to Brennan. Each mission carried just enough plausible deniability to make objection difficult, but Carly saw the truth. These were high-risk operations designed to push Jocelyn into Brennan's orbit completely, forcing her to trust him over her own family. Worse still, the new intelligence Jason had gathered suggested Brennan wasn't just using Jocelyn, he was using her as bait, drawing out enemies in a way that could easily get her killed. The revelation that Brennan had been holding Morgan, alive, hidden, leveraged, was the moment something inside Carly broke in a way that could never be repaired. For years, she had mourned him, lived with the constant ache of a mother who had buried a child, only to discover that Brennan had turned her grief into a weapon. The thought of Morgan in some cold, unknown place, a prisoner in Brennan's power structure, made her physically ill. But it also hardened her resolve to a diamond edge. This wasn't about policy or espionage anymore. This was about dismantling a man who had dared to use her children as collateral. Jason had warned her from the beginning that Brennan couldn't be trusted, but even he hadn't predicted the full scope of his depravity. And Jason's promise, made months earlier in a quiet, dangerous moment, had taken on new meaning now. He had told her plainly, if anything happened to her because of Brennan, Brennan would not live to see another day. It was a promise so absolute that it could only come from someone who had built his life on keeping such oaths. But Carly now understood something Jason had never said aloud. That promise extended to Jocelyn, to Morgan, and to anyone she loved. If Brennan's hand caused them harm, Jason would burn the entire WSB to the ground to reach him. That vow had been living in the background for months, silent but ever present, like a loaded weapon waiting for the right moment to fire. And now, Brennan seemed determined to push them to that moment. The arrogance in his recent moves was almost startling. It was as if he thought his position within the WSB insulated him from the consequences Jason could bring. But Carly knew better. She had seen Jason dismantle organizations twice as fortified. Eliminate men who thought themselves untouchable. Brennan's title, his network, even his resources wouldn't save him when the time came. The dangerous part was that Carly no longer wanted to prevent that time from coming. Where once she might have begged Jason to hold back, now she was silently preparing for the moment she could give him the order. She imagined it sometimes, just leaning close enough to say, "Do it." And watching as Jason's entire focus shifted to making it happen. The idea didn't frighten her anymore. It was liberating. Still, she played her part with care. Her hatred was not a reckless blaze but a calculated burn. She let Brennan believe she was still within reach, still conflicted enough to be swayed. She even let him think she might one day forgive him, because she knew it was easier to destroy a man when he was unguarded. Brennan believed himself a master of manipulation. But he was blind to the fact that Carly was now studying him in the same way, cataloging every weakness, every habit, every person he relied on. Jason, meanwhile, was running his own game. The trips to Dalmatia, the quiet meetings with sources inside both the WSB and DVX, the stolen fragments of classified data, all of it was building a picture. The further he dug, the more it became clear that Brennan wasn't just operating as a rogue within the WSB, he was steering factions of it, bending its missions to his private agenda. Some of those missions were clearly designed to protect his position. Others, Jason wasn't sure yet, but they reeked of personal vendettas. And now, with Morgan's captivity and Jocelyn's recruitment, Jason saw the shape of Brennan's ultimate play. It was about power, yes, but also about personal leverage over the people who might one day stand in his way. Every time Carly spoke to Jason now, the tension was there, humming beneath their words. She wanted Brennan gone, but she needed him gone in a way that couldn't be traced back to her. Jason understood. He had operated in shadows long enough to know how to erase the line between intent and execution. But he also knew Carly well enough to recognize when her patience was almost spent. The turning point came one night when Jason returned from a meeting with an informant inside the DVX. He told Carly that Brennan had shifted Jocelyn to a mission in Montenegro, a mission where her extraction point was controlled by a DVX asset loyal only to Brennan. Carly didn't react with fear. She didn't ask for more details. She just sat there, very still, and said, "So it's begun." Jason didn't need her to elaborate. He knew exactly what she meant. Brennan had crossed the final line. The order was coming, it was only a matter of when. And that was the madness of it, the part that made this entire situation volatile to the point of combustion. Both Carly and Jason knew that once the order was given, there would be no turning back. Brennan wouldn't see it coming, not until it was too late, but when it came, it would be fast, final, and absolute. Carly's vendetta had evolved into something unshakable. In the quiet spaces between their conversations, Carly imagined the endgame. Brennan stripped of his power, his secrets spilling into the light. His name reduced to nothing more than a whispered cautionary tale in the WSB's corridors. She imagined Morgan's release, Jocelyn's safe return. And the moment Brennan realized that the woman he had tried to break had been the architect of his downfall all along. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be with fire or spectacle. It would come like the tide, inevitable, unstoppable, and leaving nothing standing in its wake. Jason kept his promise. Not with an explosion that shook the skyline of Port Charles, but with the cold persistence of a man who had locked himself into a vow and treated it as a survival plan. The new adjustments he forced the story to follow began the moment he got Britt out of Dalmatia and brought her safely back to Port Charles. From the instant the plane's wheels touched the tarmac, nothing remained as scattered theories, everything linked into one relentless current, his promise, his retaliation, and an unexpected love triangle that was beginning to shape all their fates. On the power map, bringing Britt home wasn't just rescuing a witness, it was a move that stripped Brennan of control. First consequence, cracks appeared in the WSB's facade. Enough for those who once trusted Brennan to start questioning. Second consequence, Port Charles gained an emotional epicenter. Between the reports, the evidence, and the names that were surfacing, Britt's presence beside Jason sparked a new tension, quiet, hard to name, but impossible to deny, inside the space Carly had always considered hers. Jason said little, but his arrangements revealed surgical precision. Britt was taken to a neutral safe zone, every channel Brennan could exploit was severed. A trusted medical team examined her physically and psychologically, and only then did they begin reconstructing the timeline from the fragments she carried. In the silences between those steps, another adjustment took place, not in files or tactics, but in the human distance between them. From a target to be protected, Britt became an active player, providing routes, code names, Brennan's summoning signals. She was no longer led, she was leading Jason toward the network's core. Carly watched all of it with eyes that no longer believed in coincidence. She knew exactly what Jason had promised and that he would deliver if Brennan touched her family. But with Britt, someone who had once hovered at the edges of their lives, returning to Jason in this unexpected way, invisible borders between strategic ally and dangerous closeness began to fade. It wasn't simple jealousy for Carly, it was another test of loyalty and priority. Because while Jason pursued Brennan with the same unshakable resolve, he was also quietly building a new protective circle that now included Britt, one that used to belong solely to Carly and those she chose. The love triangle didn't ignite in screaming arguments, but grew through small decisions. When Jason assigned Britt the same security detail once reserved for Carly, Carly noticed. When he adjusted plans to fit Britt's recovery, she noticed. When he lingered longer than necessary to make sure Britt slept safely, she noticed. Little dots, connecting into a line. A line that would, sooner or later, point to a single conclusion. Things had gone further than anyone had planned. For Brennan, Britt's survival and ability to speak were twin strikes to his authority. He countered with a new story, spreading the idea that Britt was a weak link, that Jason's bringing her home was just a cover for a romantic attachment clouding his judgment. This was Brennan's way. Twist motives, drain trust. But here Jason's new adjustment showed he had learned to hit Brennan's blind spots. He didn't refute the whispers in the dark networks, he didn't explain. Instead, he shifted the battlefield, tightening Britt's security, mapping Brennan's finances, then abruptly locking down a data supply chain Brennan thought was hidden. While rumors spread, Brennan's network suffocated, no orders, no money, no way out. Meanwhile, a subtler adjustment took place in Port Charles. Jocelyn, at the Storm Center, realized Brennan's talk of a mission and glory was a facade. Jason bringing Britt back confirmed her gut feeling, there was a black core beneath the clean reports. For Carly, it was both relief and detonation. Her daughter was breaking free from manipulation, but the gap between her and Jason was now defined by Britt's quiet, undeniable presence. The love triangle, Jason, Carly, Britt, had its own report, one side built on a debt of life and years of memory, the other on present moment mission and gratitude evolving into proximity. Jason hadn't changed his vow to Carly, he had simply expanded the perimeter of his heart to cover more than one person. Carly understood that model, She had lived in it. Even relied on it, but understanding wasn't the same as accepting. Every adjustment in the hunt for Brennan now came with an adjustment in how Carly viewed their bond, fewer demands. More observation, fewer words, more mental notes, less clinging, more readiness to step back if the boundary broke. Britt knew exactly where she stood. She knew she had returned as both witness and test. She knew Jason's nods were for the mission and for her. She knew every time he stood at her door. He was placing himself between two crosshairs, Brennan's and the unspoken judgment of Port Charles. She didn't demand, but she altered the tempo, instead of just being protected. She helped design the traps, predicted moves, chose just enough risk to bait the enemy. That sharpened Jason's tactics. He wasn't dragging a passive target, he was working with an active partner. When the first pieces of Brennan's financing network fell, Port Charles witnessed an explosion not of gunfire but of chain collapse, a shadow sponsor withdrawing, an offshore data vault sealed. A safe house revealed as a Jason-built surveillance hub. In the noise of who belongs to whom, another silence took root, the silence of a hunter who's seen his prey lift its head in confusion. Brennan began making tiny mistakes, reusing a code phrase, taking an old route, trusting the wrong lieutenant. Under Jason's hand, each mistake became a coordinate. And the love triangle? It was confirmed not in confession, but in choices too public to be denied. Jason gave Britt a position inside the tactical circle. Carly didn't destroy it, but stepped back enough to hold her principles, never compromise with Brennan, never compromise with the WSB when they touch family, never compromise with herself when respect's line is threatened. That wasn't surrender. It was redeployment of emotional forces so the next battle wouldn't be split. When one of Brennan's transfer hubs fell, Jason fulfilled part of his promise. Not just hitting back, but breaking the arm reaching into Port Charles. And at the same time, he fulfilled a part he never vowed, bringing Britt back not as a shadow from the past, but as a living variable in the present. From there, things going further wasn't a complaint, it was a given. Further in law, Britt's evidence enough to open prosecution files. Further in the shadow geopolitics, some WSB figures began picking sides. Further in psychology, Carly accepted a reality where love and trust didn't equal possession and keeping. The new obsession, in Port Charles, then, wasn't just Brennan and his network, it was the lingering question on every lip, has the old order, where Jason protected, Carly steered, and Britt stayed at the edge, ended? Or has it morphed into something more complex, where each must learn to stand beside the other at a new distance? The answer, as always in this city, wouldn't come in a verdict. It would come in the night wind off the docks, in a coded message Jason received before dawn, in Carly's quiet nod as he put on his jacket. And in Britt's eyes staring out a window, knowing her return had shifted the path of all three forever. Jason had kept his promise, in his own way, with adjustments as precise as clockwork. Britt had come back, and not to the same place. Carly had seen, and chose not to close her eyes. The triangle was no longer rumor. It was a new emotional architecture everyone had to account for when drawing Port Charles's map. And beyond the tightening net around Brennan, beyond the files about to be cracked open, another detonation waited, the redefinition of love, loyalty, and the line between salvation and sacrifice, the very things that would decide how they would win, and what they would lose. When the end came calling.